Nestled in the rolling foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains lies what remains of the small village of Appomattox Courthouse. It began life as a stagecoach stop along the Richmond and Lynchburg Road in 1845. By 1861, it would be the county seat. Many residents of the area, including Wilmer McLean, believed that America's ongoing Civil War would not reach them. But in 1865, the rural hamlet would be launched into American memory. For 4 bloody years, America had torn itself asunder. Warring armies clashed across the countryside. The most notable, a career soldier and head of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee. Opposing him, a failed businessman and future American president, Ulysses S. Grant with the Army of the Potomac. Behind them, the two left behind carnage and devastation with thousands dead and wounded. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor, Richmond, and Petersburg. After 9 months of siege warfare, under relenting pressure and in desperate need of rations, Lee begrudgingly abandoned his position around the Confederate capital. Grant gave chase, his troops feeling the momentum of impending victory, continuously pursuing Lee west, his cavalry under Phil Sheridan cutting off any attempt by Lee to move south to link up with Joseph E. Johnston in North Carolina. Battles and skirmishes became everyday occurrences in places like Five Forks and Sailor's Creek, each time taking out swaths of men that Lee could ill afford to lose. Eventually, Union cavalry managed to get around Lee's front, placing Union troops to the east, west, and south, with the impassable James River to the north. Lee was now encircled within the vicinity of Appomattox Courthouse. Historical figures and park rangers state that the population at the time was around 100 civilians, half of whom were enslaved, put to work in the local taverns and tobacco farms. The county itself at the outset of the war had voted an overwhelming 805 to nothing in favor of secession. Lee gambled on one final attempt at a breakout. In the early morning hours of April 9th, the Confederates attacked, and met with initial success driving off Union cavalry and skirmishers. The advancing rebels under John Gordon were soon met with fresh Union infantry. Gordon demanded reinforcements, but what little reinforcements remained under James Longstreet were already bogged down with an engagement to the northeast. Lee was forced to accept the inevitable.
There is nothing left for me to do but to go see General Grant, and I'd rather die 1,000 deaths.
A ceasefire was called, and flags of truce went up along the Confederate lines. Meetings ensued over Grant's terms of surrender. The two men met in the front parlor of Wilmer McLean in the early afternoon. After exchanging pleasantries and conversing for a brief period, Grant offered the terms. Lee's men could keep their sidearms for hunting, and their horses and mules for the upcoming harvest. If they swore an oath of allegiance, they could be transported home and live undisturbed by the United States. At 3 p.m., it was done. For the men of the Eastern Theater, the war was over. As joyous shouts rose up among the men of the Army of the Potomac, Grant silenced them. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again, and the best sign of rejoicing after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations in the field." Lee addressed his men one final time in General Order No. 9, citing that the army had reluctantly yielded only to overwhelming numbers and resources. The war had not even fully ended, and the seeds of lost cause mythology had been planted. Lincoln and Grant hoped that the terms issued at Appomattox would be a symbol of reconciliation, but new fault lines were almost immediately created. Appomattox Courthouse had seen what many viewed as the end of the war. It saw the beginning of the lost cause, and even became involved in Reconstruction when the first African-American school in the area opened that October of 1865. The McLeans, as well as much of the town in the coming years, would move to Appomattox Station, their former homes falling into disrepair. It seemed the only people who still returned were the men who had been there on that faithful spring day. With the exception of these men, the site became an afterthought. Time passed. With the 1930s came the Great Depression. As part of FDR's New Deal, many more sites across the country, both historical and natural, were designated as national parks. Appomattox was one such site. Veterans had called for such moves since the 1890s, but according to Carolyn Janney and her work, War Over a Shrine of Peace, Confederate sympathizers had become opposed to any dialogue of reconciliation. inspired by the lost cause mythos that began from the moment the war ended. Despite pushbacks, 500 acres of land would be dedicated as a national shrine in 1940. Even after the war, the site had been marred with contention. A site desired to be a shrine to peace and reunion seemed to only stir resentment. To some, Appomattox had become just another footnote in a textbook. For those who wore gray, it represented the humiliating end of a cause that was ultimately flawed and ill-intentioned from the beginning. For those who wore blue, it meant the country was preserved. For some, emancipation. For others, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, it truly did represent a new birth of freedom. Today, the park sits off US Route 460. If you take the winding country roads, many signs adorning the way remark that it is the site where the country reunited. Over a century later, there are tragically divisions that still remain. The site may not represent what reconciliation was, but what we desire it to be. What a nation founded on the principles of freedom and equality for all can still be.